Hello, I'm Larry Johnson. This is Countercurrents, where we try to address current issues, but take a slightly unconventional approach with it. And we don't indulge conventional thinking. We try to think outside the box. Today, I'm happy to be able to host Larry Wilkerson. Larry Wilkerson was Chief of Staff to Colin Powell at the U.S. Department of State. Larry was a career Army officer, and he has been an outspoken pundit, particularly about the current disastrous state of U.S. foreign policy. So in a moment, we'll be with Larry Wilkerson. Thanks for watching. Let me start with my first question is more for background. How did a career Army officer wind up walking the halls of State Department? Because as you know, in your experience, military and State Department is like the men are from Mars and women are from Venus kind of thing.
It all had to do with the summer of 2000 when I was working in a private capacity for Colin Powell. And he said, I think I might be asked to be a cabinet member in the Bush administration should the governor actually become president of the United States. He parenthetically said, I'm not sure that's a possibility, but close parentheses. And I said at the time, not that moment, but about a week later when he broached the subject again, I said, well, dare I ask what cabinet position you would be seeking? I thought he would be after Secretary of Defense, the most powerful position in the U.S. government now, certainly, far more powerful than state. Rumsfeld once told him he lost more money every year than state got, and Rumsfeld lost $27 billion that year,
right?
And we were at $25 billion. And he said no. The premier position in the cabinet is Thomas Jefferson's position, Secretary of State. That took me by surprise, but later he would ask me if I would join him, and that's how it came about.
How did you first meet him?
I was teaching at the Naval War College, very, very happy and content because I was the only person who had just come from a unified command, think-pack in that case, now whatever they're calling it, Indo-Pac combatant.
Indo-PACOM.
Yeah. And the admiral called me down one day after I'd been there about a week or two. My Navy admiral in the Pacific, I'd worked for Admiral Crowell, Admiral Hayes, and Admiral Ring. They got me the job at Newport because I told them I wanted it. The Army hated me for doing that, so they put me on persona non grata list. And here I am at Newport, happy as a lark, teaching strategy and policy, which was my forte, I thought. And the Admiral calls me down and says, man, you got unified command experience. I said, yes, sir, I do. He said, I'm going to make you my joint guy. We're going to have to JPME,
Mr. Purple.
Yeah, we're going to have to go purple. So for a year, I did nothing but travel all around and for the War College to Europe, to the Pacific, everywhere, trying to figure out exactly what we should do in terms of curriculum. And in the middle of that, I get a phone call from the flag lieutenant, and he calls me down to the admiral's office, and he says, the admiral wants to see you. Go right in. Ron Kurth, who'd just been our defense attaché in Moscow. He says, you got a phone call. Take it. It's behind my desk. I noted it was a secure phone. So I picked it up, and this guy says, hold for the National Security Advisor. And we met, and the rest is history.
Oh, well, that's great. I mean, now, one thing I don't think I've ever heard you talk about, and I think it'd be helpful for, most people who watch this podcast don't have any government experience, never worked in the security field, at least within the bureaucracy. During your entire time as Chief of Staff to Colin Powell at State Department, did you guys ever have a chance? Was there ever a session of time where people sat down and talked about a strategic picture of the world? What is it we're trying to do? Or were you simply firefighters responding to every bell that went off?
A lot of that, which is, I think, the forte or weakness of the United States government, inbox management, in other words. But Powell had hired me from the Naval War College and was very explicit about this when I joined him at U.S. Forces Command in Atlanta in January 1989. He was very explicit about strategy, and he thought I had a good mind for strategy. And he said, "You're going to be my special assistant for strategy, as well as my speechwriter and a whole bunch of other things. I'll call you my man Friday."
Yeah.
And that's kind of the way we did it. And when he asked me to come over to the State Department, I said, "I'm not going to work directly for you if you don't mind, boss." He said, "Well, what do you want to do?" I said, "I want to work for the only strategic think tank in the United States government. It's called policy planning at State." "Oh, well, I'm putting Ambassador Richard Haas in there." "I didn't know that." And I said, "I still want to work there."
Yeah.
Because I had a little bit of experience with Richard when he was on the NSC staff, when Powell was National Security Advisor, indeed. And I knew Richard wanted to be deputy, badly wanted to be deputy, as did John Bolton and a bunch of other people who were going all over the world saying they were going to be deputy. Bolton, in particular, was in Paris and Berlin and other places. He was saying he was going to be the Deputy Secretary of State. Richard wasn't doing that, but I knew he wanted to be Deputy Secretary of State, so I knew it would be a downgrading if he became Director of Policy Planning. But I figured, Richard would work his way up. Richard is very ambitious.
Yeah.
And that indeed was his plan. Not only that, he was also special representative ambassador Haas for the Irish peace talks. And I was interested in that too. Anyway, I worked for the first year, maybe 16 months for Richard, which was very eye-opening because I got to see a lot of super State Department people who were squelched at almost every opportunity. And Richard, even by Secretary Powell, whom I thought was really good at empowering the Foreign Service, including policy planning. But Richard quickly figured out that I emailed with the secretary about 4 or 5 times a day. We emailed back and forth on a private account that George Tenet had set up for us, and Steve Case at AOL. Tenet had blessed it from a security point of view, and Steve Case blessed it from I can operate and I can keep things discreet and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
So we were going back and forth. Don't ask me about the State Department IG asking me for my email trove. I told him to go to hell. At any rate, we would talk, and Richard quickly realized he had another route into the secretary. And so I became sort of a left-hand man to Richard when he wanted to expose something to the secretary, and particularly when he didn't want to go through the deputy secretary, Richard Armitage, whom he thought was a cutoff for a lot of ingenuity and credibility and creativity and policy development and such. He thought Rich was, a big gorilla that cut lots of good ideas off. So he would shoot it through me, and I would invariably, if I thought it was a decent idea, which most of the time it was, I'd pass it on to the secretary. So we had this circuit going. And then one day he asked me into the office on a private chat basis, and I went in there, and he said, "I want you to become my chief of staff." I said, "Whoa, why do you want that?" He said, "Because one, I need someone to protect me, both flanks and my rear, with the press and other people," emphasis on the other people.
Yeah.
Two, I need someone that knows something about strategy and policy and the development thereof. And three, I want you to know that if you accept, you will leave with me. I said, "Well, that begs the question, are you leaving soon, or are you thinking about it?" He said, "I am." I said, "Okay, so I would go with you." He said, "Yeah, I'm telling you that because you can stay in policy planning and probably ride out 4 years. And if the president's reelected, maybe go all the time you're here at State in policy planning, or maybe work your way into assistant secretariat or something like that," which a couple of my colleagues on the policy planning staff did. I said, "Well, I'm going to leave with you because I'm going to be really a political appointee if I become chief of staff, and you want me gone when you're gone." He said, "Absolutely." So I said, "Okay," and fully expected that we would not be there much longer. And then we got so deeply mired in that fiasco, that strategic era of the First Order in Iraq, that he didn't want to leave because he felt he was the only one, including Dr. Rice, whom he had some respect for until she stuck him in the back about 93 times with a dagger, until everything just started going haywire in terms of his ability to manage what was happening in Iraq. from a State Department perspective, from a diplomatic perspective, from the perspective of Sergei Lavrov and his counterpart in Beijing, from the perspective of anybody in the world that cared a hang about the empire and what it was doing and its diplomatic instrument, he was the only one keeping it from being completely submerged, just forgotten about. And so he got this idea that he was indispensable to that process. And it took the White House embarrassing him majorly after they won the election in 2004 by summarily asking a 16th rank civil servant in the White House to call him and tell him to send his resignation letter in to wake him up. He was so furious. He went home for a week. We couldn't find him. And Rich came in to see me and he said, "Chief, should we cut orders making me acting secretary?"
Well, yeah, I guess Powell learned the hard way.
Very much.
No good deed goes unpunished in Washington.
Yep. And he and Rich, they drank each other's Kool-Aid without fail. If both were in town at 5:30 every day, they met in his office alone. I couldn't even get into the meetings. I could get into almost any other meeting, but not that one. And I think what they did was good old boy, a little maker's mark, and they drank each other's Kool-Aid. They convinced each other that they were invincible and that ultimately they would beat the Rumsfeld-Cheney tag team. They would defeat Condi's complicity therewith. And she was complicit for one reason alone. She figured out very early that if I stick close to the president, I can take Colin's place in a second term. That's my dream. That's my job. I want that job badly. So I'm not going to discipline the national security decision-making system the way I should. I'm going to go to the president on almost every issue, and I see Don and Dick have his ear more than Colin. Therefore, I'm going to have to ally with them. And I'll do that and hold my nose. And she got a wish.
Yeah. Yeah, people don't understand how toxic the Rumsfeld-Cheney relationship was.
Yes.
I don't know if you know my backstory with that. One of my very good friends, now deceased, a fellow named Bruce Bradley. Bruce was a young congressional staffer to the Kansas representative in 1964, who later went on to NATO. I forget the guy's name. And as a chief of staff at 24 years of age, there was another congressman that he was playing squash with, 2-3 times a week. Guy was named Don Rumsfeld. So in '68, Bruce was heading up the Rockefeller for President campaign. He was only like 28, and he had a guy working for him by the name of Henry Kissinger. And so when Rockefeller dropped out, Kissinger wound up with Nixon. Kissinger called Bruce and said he'd like him to be his deputy. And Bruce told him, he says, "Henry," he says, "in my experience, you are the consummate world ass kisser. Nobody does it better. But," he says, "as a boss, you'd be a son of a bitch. I could never work for you. So thank you for the offer." So Bruce opened up a firm called Bradley Woods. And in start of 1972, gets a phone call from Don Rumsfeld. He goes, "I got this young fellow. I need to get him a job. Dick Cheney." And so Bruce put Cheney on, and Cheney stayed there until he went to become chief of staff.
Yeah.
Then after that, he came back and worked for Bradley Woods while he figured out how to run for Congress. And so, I mean, this incestuous relationship goes way back. And you remember Bobby Charles? He was the
Yes.
Okay. So Bobby told me the story of when he went with Colin to a National Security Council meeting, and it was principal plus one. And it was about Afghanistan and dealing with the heroin problem. And so Bush made a decision, which is what Powell wanted. And then all of a sudden, Rumsfeld and Cheney jumped in and reversed it.
Yep.
And Bobby was just sitting there stunned that they'd have such disrespect for Bush. So
that was rare. I saw it happen once, but it was rare that they would do it in the open. What they would do is let the president make his decision. And one of the most seminal ones in this regard was the president deciding that he would not destroy the Iraqi military down to the battalion level. leave the battalion commanders in place, leave the men in place, leave the weapons in place, and use that military instrument to do what they needed to do to suppress the insurgency or whatever. And Feith was the one who sent the order. He sent the order through Walt Slocum, who never even set his foot in Iraq, but for about 4 days, he was scared to go to Iraq. Walt was a coward par excellence. And the order went down to Bremer, and Bremer said, okay, fine. So he disassembled the whole Iraqi military.
Yeah.
Tragically stupid mistake.
He's never
a whole bunch of armed people in the insurgency in 24 hours.
Yeah. Yeah. Bremer, we were friends up to that point. And then when I became a critic of the war, the friendship ruptured. Gary Vogler and I talked about our different experiences with Bremer.
I bet that was interesting.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, when Jerry, I had lunch with Jerry 2 days before he was given that offer. And when I heard that it had been made, I called him up and said, hey, who did you piss off? And he goes, no. When the president asked, you got to go. And I said, well, hey, let me help you out. Let me introduce you to Pat Lang. Now, Pat, you knew Pat.
You're right.
And, here's Pat, had been defense attaché in Saudi Arabia and Yemen. He'd hand-carried intelligence to the government of Iraq during the Iran-Iraq War. And he'd headed up the Middle East division at DIA. And Jerry goes, no, I don't need to talk to him.
That's Jerry.
Yeah. The arrogant fact. And then what he did is he brought a lot of the old crew from the CT office, Clay McManaway and Jessica LaCroix, I guess her name was. Disaster. Not an expert in amongst them.
This is a side story, but it's nonetheless revelatory. When I was working for Powell down in the District of Columbia Public Schools from about 97 to the end of my time at the State Department, because I didn't drop it when I went to state. I kept working there, not as much. But what we did was we were working in a group of schools, about 7 schools, trying to bring some kind of sobriety, some kind of real education capability to this group of schools, a high school, a middle school, and 5 feeding elementaries. And when Lieutenant General Julius Beckton became superintendent of schools, we thought we had an in. And so he put me down there in the schools. This is in 97, 98, and before state. And we're working our way through all the crime and corruption, and you wouldn't believe it. The Army Corps of Engineers putting contracts out for roofs that leaked within 6 months of spending $250,000 on them to fix them. It was a disaster. But I ran into Jerry. And I ran into Jerry because Powell started a program. We decided, hey, these schools they're not savable, not in this millennium anyway. So we got a bunch of people together and collected money. And we sent these kids, when we identified really capable ones who were energetic and somewhat inclined to education, we sent them to Archbishop Carroll, to Friends. We sent them all over to private school, Gonzaga. And then we walked them all the way through to college. We've got a bunch now that have gone through college, got their degrees, and are working out in the country in a productive way. And Jerry, in this whole process, let his Roman Catholicism get so much in his way in terms of working to support this program that I made a decision I didn't want to have anything to do with him again. He's one of these guys who, like some of the Supreme Court justices, want an American Pope. They want to divorce the Catholic Church that they believe in from Rome. Yeah. They want an American bishop, then an American Pope eventually, and they want an American Catholic Church. They're very dangerous people. A lot of them are Opus Dei types, if not official members. And it's as bad as Christian nationalism. In fact, I think they're now allied with a bunch of the people who want Christianity to be the religion of this country.
Yeah, I believe Jerry's conversion to Catholicism came pretty late in life, in his 50s or early 60s.
Those are some of the most dangerous people, though. When they get it late in life, it's usually the revelation, the Paul, on the road to Damascus. Beam! Oh, God has selected me.
Well, yeah, and that appears to be directed a lot of policy right now with respect to what's going on in Israel.
Yes.
People trying to manufacture Armageddon.
I'm not sure that with Netanyahu, it's anything but he's Joshua. He's slaying everything in his path per God's instruction. I said to someone a couple of days ago just made me angry. And I said, if your God is the God of the Old Testament, he's an abomination, an absolute abomination.
Yeah. Yeah. This finding excuses and justifications for burning children.
Yep.
Is
it's God's will.
Yeah.
God said do it. So I'm doing it.
Well, so from the strategic standpoint, you were onto this early. I put up the interview that you did with Gary Vogler and I forget who hosted that podcast, but
Aaron Good.
Yeah, and Gary freely admitted that you had tried to tell him way before that the war in Iraq in 2003 was all about oil. And Gary was, no. We were doing something good, I think. But
we actually, if I recall right, we actually had a battle on Rachel Maddow's show where she was. It was called the Iraq War for Oil or something like that.
Yeah, that was 2014.
Yeah, she had both sides on there.
And I guess he was on with Bremer. Was that?
I think Bremer was. I don't remember if he was on the exact same panel-like thing we had, but yeah, he was involved though. So when I give it to Rachel, she wanted to hear both sides of the argument.
So when did you first become aware of the role of oil in that 2003 war?
I took the strategic approach that I'd always had into it, Powell and I pretty much agreed on. When Carter made his statement at the State of the Union address, I think in 78 or 79, and said that it was then a vital interest to the United States, and I wrote this in the preface to Gary's book.
Right.
It's not about ExxonMobil or Royal Dutch Shell, it's about access, consistency, and price. And that's what we guaranteed. And we would do that. We would do that for the world as a corollary, but we were doing it for our friends and allies at the time, particularly Japan and ourselves, of course. And even though we became more or less energy independent in some respects, we still had a lot of allies that depended on that. And so that was my approach, that if it was all about oil, it was about that fundamental strategy, which had been our approach for a long time. The approach that I used as a planner when I was at U.S. Think Pac working for Admiral Crowell and then Admiral Hayes, that's what we were fundamentally focused on. That's the reason we did Operation Earnest Will and Operation Praying Mantis. So when I saw it being contaminated and being twisted by people who didn't even understand what it meant and what it was and how we should implement the strategy and how we should not implement the strategy and just blunderbussing their way through the Levant. I told Powell on a number of occasions, and he would agree more or less, but he didn't know what to do about it. He was trying to work the fringes, as it were, in order to keep it from being so bad that we took a real strategic fall, rather than just killed a whole bunch of people for no reason and spent a whole bunch of trillions of dollars for no reason other than to make Dick Cheney rich and a few other of his cronies. But we all, basically we all failed. We just miserably failed.
Well, did you ever have a moment with Powell where he, came to the full realization, got pissed off that he'd been completely bamboozled by the CIA with respect to the weapons of mass destruction canard?
It happened in series, if you will, through the summer and terminated in August when George didn't even have the courage to call him personally, but let John do it through Rich, McLaughlin do it through Rich. Because Powell had just come in my office maybe 24 hours prior. He opened the door, stuck his head in and said, "Turn on that damn TV and go to CNN. You're going to see George is still putting up those damn pictures of those mobile biological labs and still thinks that they exist, And he slammed the door and went back in his office. And it was about 48 hours later that John called Rich, and Rich came in and disabused him, as he put it to me, of his third pillar. The three pillars of his presentation: the nuclear program, the mobile biological labs, and the huge stocks of chemical weapons and so forth. And periodically over the summer, either George or one of his lackeys had called him and told him, well, another pillar went. And, by the time George gets up at Georgetown and says, quote, "I never said that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction," unquote, Powell's ready to throttle him. And when I say that to him, in his office. When I say that to him, I'll be there with you when we throttle him or something like that. Oh, I don't have any anger against George. But I looked at him and said, are you just trying to lie to me? Or what are you doing? You don't have any anger towards Charm. I'd like to hang him by the yard arm, fricassee him. Cut his, privates off and slide him down a razor blade into a pool of iodine. Massacre the guy. The guy lied to me and you repeated. No, that was John. Well, let's go get John then. Yeah. He restrained his anger and would not display it to me. He didn't display it until they told him through that functionary, called him on the phone, called Marjorie, his executive secretary, and put her through to him. And she told him to submit his resignation letter. He threw the phone down. This is all Marjorie telling me this, his executive secretary, because I didn't see it. I heard it because my office was right next to his. He stormed down to her IBM Selectric. He asked her in a very angry voice for a piece of stationery. He rolled it into the IBM Selectric and typed out his own retirement letter, signed it, gave it to the executive secretary to transfer it to the executive secretary for the NSC and then to the NSC. And here's the real rub. The next day, a call came from another functionary telling him to resubmit the letter because he'd made a typo.
Yeah.
He was furious. That's when he disappeared. He disappeared. We couldn't find him. The only way I had any contact with him was his driver, Otis, who was a retired Army E7, been with him a long time. And Otis would report to me every now and then on the secretary's whereabouts.
Oh, man. Well, the reason I wasn't distracted by what you were saying, I was trying to see if I could find, let me show you this.
Yeah.
See, this is a CIA Christmas ornament.
I didn't know they did that. I get the White House's packages all the time and states. I didn't know CIA put those things out. Geez. Beloved.
Can you imagine the ego of these people?
Yeah.
I mean, I think he was the first and only to ever put out a Christmas ornament with his mug on it. This is George Tenet for those of you watching at home.
Let me give you another vivid insight into Tenet. You probably don't need any, but I'm in the Waldorf Astoria at 2 a.m. in the morning of the presentation at the UN. Phil Mudd knocks on my door. I was not really a happy camper. I was changing the presentation majorly because he had gone through it on the top floor of the UN mission in a cafeteria. They have a cafeteria up there.
Uh-huh.
And we had rehearsed it, and he says, too long, go cut it. And he looked at me and he said, you know where to cut. Because we'd already been cutting the hell out of the terrorism contacts and things like that, especially the implication that Al-Qaeda had something to do with Saddam Hussein, vice versa. So I'm just taking as much as I can out. And Phil Mudd comes in and he looks over my shoulder and he says, what are you doing? That was approved tonight at the final rehearsal. No, the secretary told me to cut things out of it. Well, it looks to me like looking over your shoulder, you're cutting things in a very important area for which I'm responsible. I said, yeah, I'm cutting a lot of the terrorist contact crap out. He goes out the door in a huff. Of all things, CIA director, what the hell? He's staying in a different hotel. He's not in the hotel the secretary's in the Waldorf, which is typical of the Secretary of State. He is suite in the Waldorf. Put that in your head, Larry. So about 5 minutes before 9, on the UN Security Council floor, Scott Sorsa, who was a God save for me, because the CIA had no graphics capability whatsoever. They were brain dead when it came to a presentation. Couldn't do the Arabic English translations, things like that on screen. Yeah. And I insisted on multiple translations because I didn't want them fooling me with their translation of a particular Farsi or Arabic conversation. And here's another place where Tenet captured the secretary's attention because he wouldn't let him use one of the intercepts. Wouldn't let him. It just went bananas over it. He said he would resign and go to the president if Powell insisted on using that. Oh, okay. Why? Powell said. Well, you will understand this. You're a military man. You'll understand this. if Saddam Hussein knows what we know from that intercept, then he is going to preempt anything we do with chemical and biological weapons. So you'll have to go ashore in full mop gear. It's going to be hot. That's what's going to happen. You'll get people killed. So you can't use that. Well, it's a piece of drivel, really. But what that exchange did was convince Powell and me, even more so, that George was serious about these intercepts being valid.
Yeah, yeah.
Otherwise, they were just circumstantial crap. They could be interpreted any number of ways, but CIA chose to interpret them in the most harmful way. So when we get on the floor, back to my story, we get on the floor, Tenet walks up to me in that smarmy Greek way that he has. He puts his arm around my shoulder and he says, I understand last night you were cutting the presentation. You're damn straight I was. Well, what did you cut out? Well, you'll see when the secretary gives the address. And I broke off from him and went back to Scott, who was adjusting the microphone. And he went back and took his seat. But you probably know the last thing Powell said at that rehearsal is, do you stand by everything I just gave, George? Everything. And George said, I'm more worried about my oversight committees in the Congress should something be wrong than I am anything else. So, yes, I stand by it. I stand completely by it. And Powell looked at him and said, good, because you're going to be in camera tomorrow, just to my rear, which is unusual for a CIA. George said, okay.
Unbelievable. Well, hey, by the way, as you know, Valerie Plame and I were classmates at the career trainee program. So when did you first meet her? After, you became aware of her in that summer of July of 2003 when her name got bandied about and the counterattack on her and Joe started.
I knew Joe fairly well, and I had great empathy for him and sympathy for him and his family. I didn't know Valerie at all. I think I'd met her once, but I didn't know her at all. But Joe and I became fairly close as I developed my own antagonisms toward the empire, if you will.
Right.
And Joe just augmented those and reinforced them. And I knew what an intelligent individual he was, and I knew what a good diplomat he'd been. And so that sort of worked its way into understanding what was happening to them through his eyes. And he was very honest about it. He thought it was entirely his fault. And I watched him deteriorate, and I watched him go to his death, really. And through that process, I connected with Valerie. And then we've known each other ever since. And we had a very good time to talk privately at length when I went out to the school that her new husband is president of out in Silver City, New Mexico. And we spent some mornings in coffee shops and things like that talking, and we were just amazed at how our views dovetail. Mm-hmm. And not just our views, philosophical or otherwise, but our details are not about what happened. She reinforced and I reinforced hers, and then it went like that. One morning for about an hour and a half, looking at Billy the Kid's. He walked in there, and there was Billy the Kid. He was about 9 feet tall in a facsimile, and there was Pat Garrett over in the corner. He was about 6 inches.
Well, I think you're like I first met. I met Valerie in September of '85. So I knew her when she was a young thing. Joe and I were actually, ironically, with Pat Lang at the Nixon Center on the conference that Dimitri Simes called in December of 2002.
Oh, the Russian traitor?
Yeah. And we were asked, it was a conference about, are we going to go to war in Iraq? So that's where I first met Joe. And I didn't realize at the time that he was married to Valerie because when we were in training, we were all undercover. So I knew her as Valerie P. I didn't even know Plame.
Yeah.
If you would have put a gun to my head and said, what's her last name? I couldn't have told you. And so, at that time, we were all sort of the opinion, well, gee, they must have some really super secret intelligence because this doesn't make sense, but they must really have something. That was the general conclusion. And then, when the whole thing with Joe Wilson blew up, and I was looking at that from the outside, thinking, oh, that, we weren't friends at that time. But then one of my CIA buddies called me up and said, "Hey, that's our Valerie." I go, "What?" And then when I realized who she was, we tried to mount a counterattack. There were 5 of us that went on, did an ABC News Nightline. Defending Valerie as, this nonsense that she was not undercover and that she was some glorified secretary and all that crap. But they paid, her and Joe really paid a terrible price. And as you pointed out, I think Joe paid for that with his life. It
Yes.
led to the Depression and all. And it's unfortunate. But I think what your story illustrates, and it's relevant to today, what's going on both with respect to Ukraine and Israel, is that it's more of a personality game than it is a strategic game in terms of people acting according to a plan. Or would you disagree?
No, I think there's a huge component of that. It reminds me of what I think history tells us, whether you're reading Gibbon or whomever might be the historian, of what Rome was like at the end, where people were doing more to injure their Roman enemies than they were to injure their Rome's enemies. They were actually involved in this internecine business. Shakespeare illustrates it pretty well in Julius Caesar. I think we're at that stage. I think it often makes is more of consequence that the characters involved are who they are than it does the issues are what they are. The decisions more often get made on that basis rather than on a cool, calm, reasoned appreciation of what's best for the national interest of the country. We haven't done that for a long, long time. When Powell and Will Taft, his lawyer, and I don't know if you know Will, but
no, I don't.
Will had quite a history. Will Taft IV, a very famous name in Ohio. And Will had been Deputy Secretary of Defense. I actually knew Will somewhat because I was in Hawaii at the time, and he made a couple of trips out there, and I got to squire him around one time. So Will was a very good lawyer, and he was a very, very much an old school Republican, an Eisenhower Republican. And when Will and Powell made their argument about it might not be the best thing to do to go to war over 9/11, they marshaled a lot of really powerful reasons in my mind, one of which was you don't want to elevate these terrorists to warrior status. You will have no way to deal with them within Geneva. You will have no way to deal with them, period, unless you fabricate one. And you probably are going to do irreparable damage over the long haul to America's real power, much of which is tested in its reputation, because you can't go to war. And I think Powell used the analogy of, Rich used to use this all the time. If you wrestle with a pig, you'll both get dirty and the pig will love it. Mm-hmm. That's essentially what Osama bin Laden's objective was, in my view. It was to use the empire's own hubris to bring it down, to start the cracks in that edifice and to bring it down. And that's kind of the argument they marshal. This is a military man who'd been chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff saying these kinds of things. Will was doing most of the legal arguing about it, abandoning Geneva and how difficult it would be to come back, if ever, and what it might mean in terms of other actions that would be, quote, on the dark side, unquote, as Cheney said. And it just rolled off Cheney and Rumsfeld's back like water off a duck. The president did listen a bit, but as he said later to a Christian group that came to the Oval Office to give him religious fervor and religious support, my lust is up. My rage is up. I want to kill somebody. Calm me down, will you please? These are almost his exact words, if I'm reported to right by the Secret Service people who are on the door. And, Bush was susceptible. Powell, he coined a metaphor with me one day that I thought personified the whole process, really. He said, Cheney and Rumsfeld know how to get the president to pull his .45 and start shooting. And I don't know how to get him to put it back in the holster. Mm-hmm. And it's very dangerous when he starts shooting. And in other words, the president was inclined to their point of view, and he wouldn't listen to Powell. Here's the real reason they wouldn't listen to Powell. I kept telling the boss this. Karl Rove was whispering in Bush's ears. One of Bush's major objectives was to beat Daddy. Beat Daddy, be reelected in a second term. Drove him mercilessly to think about that. Rove played on that like a Stradivarius violin. Rove told him his number one arch enemy opponent of merit would be Colin Powell in 2004. And you can imagine what that did to the relationship between Powell and Bush.
Well, what did you observe about U.S.-Russian relations during your tenure there with Powell? Because some of it was consequential in terms of the United States walking away from the anti-ballistic missile treaty.
Yep. That made Powell apoplectic. We negotiated the Moscow Treaty forthwith to try and, salve some of the Russians' injury and wound. It didn't do a whole lot of good. I don't even think two Americans could tell you what the Moscow Treaty even said. It was only a 2-page treaty, but it essentially said we were going to continue on down to about a range of 1,200 to 2,200 on each side. We'd come down to about 5,000, 6,000 on each side from Cold War totals of 30,000 or so on each side, 30,000 on their side, I think 28,000 on our side, something like that. And we've been destroying warheads furiously with everyone's acquiescence. Helmut Kohl, Francois Mitterrand, Mikhail Gorbachev, Shevardnadze, everybody in the ball game wanted to do this. We got stopped by the lawyers. You may recall this. We got stopped over liability issues. Probably one of the worst mistakes anybody ever made in the world. We were going to go as fast as possible down to very, very low levels. And the Joint Staff had concluded that we could probably, and this has never been published, we could probably exist and deter if we could get the rest of the world to accept this on about 600 weapons. Imagine that. Yeah. In other words, sort of like the Chinese did under Mao. Right. That's enough. We don't need any more. It's too dangerous to have more, too inviting to a first strike, that sort of thing. And all that went to hell in a handbag. And the guy who really started it going to hell in a handbag, I got to watch do it. And that was William Jefferson Clinton. And the only motivation I could detect was that he felt like the money that was going to accrue and therefore benefit the economy and him, because some of it was directed to Democrats, from the military-industrial complex writ large. And this even included the niche complex associated with nuclear weapons, like tritium manufacturers and all the things, the labs and everything. And it's a very niche part of the complex, but it's very wealth producing. Even in the aftermath, you got a billionaire in Salt Lake City, for example, from disposing of nuclear waste. So it's a hugely, hugely wealthy part of the complex. And I watched them just recoil in anger and look for ways for retribution because of what we were doing. So Clinton came along and accommodated all that. And next thing we know, we're expanding NATO. Lockheed can sell its weaponry to additional countries, and we were off to the races. And everything we started, everything Kohl, Mitterrand, Thatcher, Major, Shevardnadze, Gorbachev, Powell, Bush, Baker, everything we started went to hell in a handbag in a very short time. And when Powell left in December of '93, having served a year with Clinton. The one thing we had to remember that year by was Dr. Perry's coming in, and essentially after Aspen bit the bullet over Mogadishu, there's a story too, my God. Powell's still in the Pentagon. Powell sits down, writes a handwritten memo, gives it to Cammie Brown. She, an E7, Army E7, and I were the only people in the office with him. Most people don't know this. A chairman on the way out, you may know it, hangs around for about 30 to 45 days just in case, in the E-ring in the basement. And so we're in the E-ring in the basement. He gives me this and he says, give it to Cammie. Don't you dare make a copy. I did. And run it up to Cheney or to Aspen. And Cammie says, put it in the Secretary of Defense's hand. Yep, don't give it to his EA or anything else. Put it in the Secretary of Defense's hand. Powell has already prepped it. She goes up, and I said, did you do it? She said, yep, he took it in hand. What it was a very wisely crafted note on how Aspen, as Secretary of Defense, could shift legitimately much of the blame to Clinton, and how he could do it in a way that wouldn't be so obtrusive, wouldn't kind of look that way until maybe later. Powell was a genius at this sort of thing. And Aspen, to his credit, really, essentially said no and went out and took the full blow. And, he was fired afterwards, and he died shortly after that. And that was a tragic event, to which Cammie Brown and I probably were the only witnesses. And that really, I think, soured Powell majorly on the way out the door. That plus the fact that when he went up to say goodbye to Cheney previously, he was gone. Didn't say a word to Powell. Served almost 4 years together. Gone. He's out the door. Didn't even say goodbye.
Yeah.
A cold-hearted man. And so Powell left thinking about that $6.5 million advance he'd gotten from Harold Evans at Random House and the book he was going to write. The only political memoir that's ever returned royalties, according to Harold, and is still paying royalties to Alma's successors. He dedicated himself to that and forgot about it. And, in some ways, I was surprised when he said that he was thinking about going back into the administration, Bush's administration, because I thought he'd gotten enough of it as chairman.
So when he became Secretary of State under Bush,
yeah.
Do you recall when his first meeting with Vladimir Putin? Did he have a first meeting with Vladimir Putin and sort of the impressions of the Russians, what they were undergoing at the time?
I'm sure he probably did. I'd have to go back and check my notes if he had an actual meeting with Putin. His main subject of conversation with me with regard to both China and Russia were their foreign ministers, as you might expect.
Right.
They were his contacts. He thought Sergei Lavrov was probably one of the best diplomats he'd ever met. And he and Sergei talked on his cell phone all the time. Tenet came over one time to tell him the NSA was monitoring his phone calls, taping them, and everything else. Well, after he came down from the ceiling, learning that the NSA was copying his or recording his phone calls with anybody, he essentially said, oh, no, I'm not stopping. Well, it's not secure. So what? I'm doing diplomacy. This is how I do diplomacy. Story in case. EP3 strays a little too close to Haiphong Island and Hainan Island, and F8 comes up with one of China's best fighter pilots in it, who was very used to doing these sorts of things. He comes up and he's going to do his typical thing, afterburners in front of the EP3 and scare the bejesus out, make them crap in their pants.
Yeah, an EP3, for those who are not familiar with the jargon, it's a plane.
Yeah, it's a big reconnaissance plane, very slow moving. This F8 goes right in front of it, clips his tail off, crashes and kills the pilot in the South China Sea. EP3 is so badly damaged it has to go down on Hainan Island, one of the most secretive places in China for military. I think they have sub pens and a bunch of other things there. So Powell gets on his cell phone, doesn't even coordinate, gets on his cell phone. He knows that the Chinese Leadership Party is traveling in South America. He calls Chen Chi-chen, probably dead now, but probably the man in China who knew the United States better than anybody else in China, spoke fluent English, calls him, and he apprises the Chinese Leadership Party of the fact that it's happened. Chen was very, very happy about that because they didn't even know from their own people that it had happened. Powell got on it so fast. And before you know it, they've worked it out. China will apologize in Chinese or in English, and we'll apologize in Chinese. That's really what it worked out to. And we'll get our plane back. We were worried about those, I think it was 24 sailors on board that plane and some very secure gear, which they had not been able to totally destroy with thermite grenades and such. The Chinese took it. So we had one thing to do. We had to make it look diplomatic. So we got Admiral Joe Brewer, who you'll remember was also ambassador to China, We sent him to Beijing to smooth it all out and make sure that both communiques, one in English, one in Chinese, were what they were going to be.
Mm-hmm.
They told him, you go back and you tell your Secretary of Defense, if he sends a similar emissary, we will give him his plane back intact. Well, he sent a Navy lieutenant junior grade.
Oh,
The Chinese chopped the plane up in pieces and sent it back cash on delivery to the Pentagon.
yeah. It's just so foolish.
We averted a catastrophe because Powell was on his cell phone, and that was diplomacy for him. And he had immense respect for Lavrov, and he didn't have some respect for the Chinese foreign minister at that time, but he did know that it was very important to stay in contact with him on a recurring basis.
Mm-hmm. Well, during that first year at State, as Powell being Secretary of State, Putin started making the move against the oligarchs. And I recall, my friend Bruce Bradley, who I had mentioned to you, he got me connected with a lobbying firm in D.C. called APCO, and they were hired by the Mikhail Khodorkovsky, trying to figure out what's
Citizen K.
Yeah. So did the issue of all these Jewish oligarchs that were, that Putin was cracking down on, did that come before State at any time that you recall?
We talked about it in a personal capacity, private capacity, and I made such assertions as Anatoly Chubai and Larry Summers had conducted a fire sale in Moscow and sold off all the old Soviet assets to a bunch of oligarchs and made such huge amounts of money off the fees they charged that we were going to regret it.
Mm-hmm.
And he was like, well, that's just the way things happen when one empire goes down and the other empire is triumphant. I said, no, it's not necessarily that the investment bankers descend on the defeated empire and sell all of its assets to people who are going to be our enemies in the future. And it didn't register with him that much. And since I've come to believe that was precisely what happened. Matter of fact, I think Larry Summers was fired from Harvard not because of his impolitic remarks about women and their ability to do science and math, but because Harvard figured out where all the billions that he funneled into their endowment came from.
Yeah. Do you if Powell had stayed through Bush's second term, would there have been the same push to expand NATO, do you think?
George Kennan, 99 years old at the time, as I recall, 98, somewhere along there. Henry Kissinger, Brent Scowcroft, all passed through the office and said, disaster, a strategic error of the first proportion. Those are almost Kennan's exact words. And I think Powell came to believe that was probably the case. But as I said, once he was out of there, wasn't of concern to him anymore.
Yeah. And then Condi Rice was all over that. I mean, with her anti, conceptualizing of modern day Russia as the old Soviet Union.
Yeah. Powell would call me periodically. We grew further and further apart. At the end there, because of torture and other things, we were. It's fair to say we were at loggerheads.
Yeah.
We weren't even hardly speaking. Add to that the UN presentation, which I was becoming more and more acquainted with, and he put me in charge. You may recall that Admiral Church was put in charge by Donald Rumsfeld of figuring out how Abu Ghraib happened. Well, Powell burst into my office one day and said, some photographs are going to come out, and they're horrible, and I want to know how we got here. The armed forces were involved in torture of other human beings. I want to know how we got here. You get me the TikTok. I've already got Will Taft working on the legal aspects. Admiral Church is working on it for Don. I want you to coordinate with Admiral Church. I want to know how we got here. So I spent the next 6-7 months building a dossier on how we got here. People helped me, like Jane Meyer up at the New Yorker. I got more from open sources than I got from classified information, though I got all the classified information too. The only thing I didn't get was a full readout on the rendition, detention, interrogation program of the CIA, but I got that from the Congress later. So I'm thinking at the time, man, he was furious. He was furious. But I've come to find out, and I began to get an inkling of it when I was there, that he was talking about the armed forces. And that was his real problem, that we had contaminated, Don had contaminated the armed forces.
Mm-hmm.
And that's true. He did. That 27-page memo or whatever, I have a copy in the basement, the one that said through double D, all the things you can do. And that Alberto Moro went into the general counsel, Bill Haynes, and said, listen, this constitutes torture under the law. Well, not under John Hughes' law. I'm not using John Hughes' law. At that point, I had to agree with my inner self saying Powell could not have known about this program. He just couldn't have. Well, an ABC investigative reporting team played me a tape that undoubtedly George Tenet must have made, because he was the only one in the room that would have had the gonads to carry a tape recorder into the meeting. And I could hear Powell's voice, I could hear Condi's voice, I could hear Cheney's voice, I could hear the president's voice, and I could hear Tenet's voice. And they're talking about, and Condi's reinforcing, you need to torture them more, you need to torture them more. This was what they call the high-value detainee program.
Yeah.
The CIA was running. So I had to conclude, unless that was a manufactured tape, that Powell knew about that program. And it was a question of my mind anyway, that they would have kept that kind of thing from their Secretary of State if they were doing it in such a stovepipe manner. They would at least want him to know about it, I would think. And apparently that blew the last vestige of faith in his word out of my mind. And after that, he would call me on the phone. He would say, you said this. And I would say, yep, I did. You need to be quiet. You need to not say things like that. I did not say that. I would get the email out of the file. I would read it to him, and he would hang up.
Yeah, I know what it's like having, if you will, a mentor where the things go sour. Because I had a very close relationship with Pat Lang, but when this whole war in Ukraine broke out, and he was convinced that the Ukrainians were going to prevail and that they'd launch an Afghan-style insurgency and that Russia would collapse. And I candidly think Pat was a victim of the injury from the vaccine. That it really caused a decline in his mental capabilities, because the Pat Lang I used to know would never, ever have been advocating that the Ukrainians had a snowball's chance in hell of winning this thing. What do you make? So you've got this background. You and I both. I've got a much different experience than you at a lower level, but we've seen how the sausage is made inside. Yeah. We know what the final product, how that comes out. Who's making the damn sausage right now with respect particularly to Israel, and then as far as State Department, DOD, and the White House goes?
In a very large degree, I think Mearsheimer's right. I think there are some Jewish and non-Jewish billionaires in this country who have a lot of the apparatus by the gonads, so to speak, and they are controlling what goes on. But I also think, and one of the things I taught at William & Mary, and I think my experience taught me, is that there's never a single reason. There's always a multiplicity of reasons and a multiplicity of culprits advocating each one of these reasons. And the president's job, and I watched H.W. Bush do this rather well, and it takes experience with the bureaucracy, experience with diplomacy, experience with security and other factors impinging on. And you have to be able to parse it and find the best solution. Well, we haven't had a president capable of that. They've all been totally inexperienced, from Obama to even Biden, because Biden, as Powell used to say all the time, runs his mouth far too much. If he were ever anything other than a senator, he'd be a dangerous man.
Right, right.
So when you look at the multiplicity of things beyond what John talks about, the Israel lobby, which he defines rather well, and you look at the other factors, everything from about 40% of America's visceral appreciation of, but no knowledge of at all, the Holocaust and what happened, and their appreciation of what Israel means and their shame over the United States' performance from roughly the early 30s on. The pictures of the concentration camps and those sorts of things, the Holocaust, the Israelis have been very, very clever in doing this. The Holocaust Museum is just the peak of the iceberg, if you will. The whole body of things. They're in our high schools. They're in our grammar schools. They're in our middle schools. They control in many states the way the curriculum reflects the situation in the Middle East. They've been very elaborate in the way they've taken over this country. And in that sense, it's bigger than what John says in terms of the Israel lobby. It's what they've done to the American citizenry. And only now, and this is Netanyahu's greatest accomplishment, I think, greatest accomplishment, is it beginning to unwind? Mm-hmm. Is it beginning to shred? I had a rabbi in New York whom I've known for 15, 20 years. I think he's the only Jewish rabbi to be in the same synagogue for 50 years. He met Yitzhak Rabin when Yitzhak Rabin was a firebrand, almost a little Netanyahu. And then he met him later when he'd transitioned into believing in his heart of hearts that two states had to be created. Otherwise, Israel would be torn apart. Yeah. And so Netanyahu had to engineer his assassination, which Bibi did just as surely as I'm sitting here with those political rallies that ginned up the settlers and got one of them to go shooting. So he said to me, the greatest cause of anti-Semitism in the largest against the largest Jewish community in the world, much of which is right here around you in New York. We were in New York at the time at Great Neck, is Bibi Netanyahu. So Bibi is a big factor in divesting some of these people in this country of their enamorment of Israel. And that's going to be, I think, one of the ultimate unwindings of Israel's fate is that one morning it's not going to happen like water dripping on granite. It's going to be a moment of clarity. Monday night you're going to go to sleep, and Tuesday morning you're going to wake up, and America's no longer going to be, or Israel's no longer going to be, whichever way you look at it, the other's poodle. Mm-hmm. We are going to break apart. That's going to be existential for Israel, of course. And this could be part of the ingredients of that breaking apart. But it also could be a part of, as you well know, a truly disastrous situation in the region and maybe the world.
Yeah, I call it the Exodus dichotomy. So people that your age, my age, we remember the Paul Newman, Eva Marie Saint movie that portrayed Israel as David, the Arab Muslim world is this giant Goliath, raping, killing, plundering, and little David rising up to fight him off. So that's been the narrative for most of our lives. But now, I've started asking random people who are 40 years of age and under, hey, seen the movie Exodus? They look at you cross-eyed. What?
Right.
Never seen it? Not part of their consciousness?
But they are seeing slaughter in Gaza.
They're seeing TikTok. They're seeing a baby burning, hands waving, people screaming, heads blown open. That's what they're seeing.
Yep.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. That's changing. So let me, I've kept you for about an hour. So let me get you out with this. I'll leave the easy question to last. Let's assume that Israel is going to launch a retaliatory strike against Iran before the election here in the United States. What do you think are the consequences? What flows from that?
It depends on the targets and the effectiveness. If the targets are what Netanyahu has said, military targets alone, and if they are reasonably effective, then I look for Iran to come back with a little bit up on the ladder. And then all bets are off, I think, beyond that. But your question, I think, was aimed at the election. I think what we just did with this 30-day statement or whatever was a gross political act.
Yes.
It was to Netanyahu, let's not do anything that will provoke the Iranians to do something that will disturb the election. So let's not do anything really except maybe your very carefully calculated response to their latest before the election. Because then we might really get angry with you, especially if you influence the election. And if Trump wins, of course, that's just smoke.
Yeah.
It doesn't make any difference because Trump has already said, I think this is one thing I believe him on, that he'll be even tougher on the Palestinians and the Arabs in general than Biden has been. So I think it was a pure political act to do that. I don't think it had anything to do with a change of heart in the U.S. government.
Oh, no. In fact, I believe it was pure gaslighting of the American Muslim voters.
Yeah.
Because it's to try to toss them aside, say, yeah, we're really trying to stop. And it's like, wait, if you're really trying to stop it, number one, you don't leak the letter.
Yeah.
Number two,
go talk to Tehran.
Yeah.
Number two, Tehran was told, about Bill Burns and Blinken and everybody else. Just wait, don't do that. We're gonna have a ceasefire. They know we lied through our teeth.
Yeah. No, and then number two, you don't give Netanyahu 30 days. You say, hey, you got a week. The maximum. Stop it now. Get those aid convoys in there. Get these people the food, the water, the medical care they need, or we're cutting you off. If they were serious, they're not serious. You're absolutely right. This is just nothing more than a crass political gesture.
I fell for Lloyd Austin when he stood there on the border with Yoav Gallant, and then later when he stood by his plane, a few hours later, he stood by his plane and he said, diplomacy, no invasion of Lebanon, diplomacy, going to have a 21-day ceasefire, going to have diplomacy. That was colluded. That was with Yoav Gallant. Yoav Gallant knew that he was doing what Yoav wanted him to do, what Bibi wanted him to do, and that was to lull the Lebanese into thinking there wouldn't be an invasion.
Yeah.
That way the surprise would be part of the tactical success in the early days.
Well, another dimension I'm thinking about this, that while the current media portrayal is that the United States is trying to discourage any attack before the election, there's a part of me that wonders if, in fact, they wanted on the hopes that it will derail BRICS, because the BRICS summit is going to take place in a week and a half.
Yep.
And that the United States would be quite happy to see a war break out there that would derail BRICS and throw that whole alliance into an uproar. What do you think about that?
Political aspect of it, and I saw this with George W. Bush. If he's got a political advisor like Karl Rove, that political advisor will be whispering to Biden that maybe Harris too. I'm sure Harris will be there when the whisper takes place. If we're in a war, you've got a better chance of winning than if we're not in a war.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, one that we're actually in.
Yeah. Yeah. So on that cheery note, hey, I appreciate your time and, getting all the background on the stories, because I think it helps, it helps people when you do your analysis and make your presentations. You're coming out of a depth of experience that's always difficult to convey to people in, a 1 minute, 2 minute burst. They need to understand the context. And that's what I'm trying to use these kinds of interviews for, that, not to deal with the daily TikTok,
right?
But really, help people understand the tapestry, how it was painted or woven. So thank you.
That's a good initiative, a good objective. And these guys from Veterans for Peace last night were, in their own ways, sort of in the same boat. They wanted to know more about what is really happening and what can we do about it. And I think they were quite dismayed at the end when I didn't have a whole lot of things to tell them what they could do about it. Because it's very difficult to say, well, our democracy has failed, which I'll be happy to say, but then you want to beg the question, or you have begged the question, how do we fix it? That's a much more difficult proposition. You want to go, what the Declaration of Independence says?
Yeah.
in the course of human events.
Well, one of the I've come to the position that one of the lessons of the collapse of the Soviet Union and the rise of Novorossiya, the new Russia, is that's a possible path forward for the United States. In other words, the shock and horror of what the Soviets went through when their society fell apart, and they experienced 10 years of intense pain and suffering. But
and an alcoholic baboon at the top of it.
but you go there today, and it's a remarkable place. It's not some authoritarian nightmare. It's alive. It's vibrant. It's clean. It's safe. It works. It's to see that kind of transformation take place, and part of it I attribute to Putin by virtue that, just as Trump has said, "Make America great again." Well, his was about make Russia great again. As far as let's focus on Russia. We're not going to go out and try to fix the world problems. We're going to stay here at home and focus on fixing Russia's problems.
Yep.
And it's been, I think it's a fascinating accomplishment. So that I offer that to people sometimes as hope. There's a path forward, but I'm afraid we're going to be passing through some fire to get there.
Yeah. The fact that we've spent the money we spent on Ukraine and Gaza, and we're looking at the devastation we're looking at in Florida, North Carolina, South Carolina, East Tennessee, and maybe even more to come because the hurricane season's not over yet, has got to register on some people eventually.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. This is money that could be used for our own country that we're squandering in wars that can't possibly be won in the sense of winning, and that are serving a very few well.
Yeah. Well, hey, man, thanks so much.
Yep.
We'll end it there.
Thank you.
We'll do it again, though, sometime.
All right. I support your objective wholesale. Take care.
All right, man. Thanks. Bye-bye. Mm-hmm. And that's our current session for today, Countercurrents, with Larry Wilkerson. Thank you for watching. Please hit the like button, subscribe if you will. The more subscribers we get, the better we can build this channel up. The goal is to, as I said at the outset, we want to discuss current issues from an unconventional standpoint and not get caught up with conventional wisdom. So hopefully we accomplish that today. Thanks for watching.